Hey everyone, it's Kevin P. McAuliffe here, and I am back again with another Doddle TV tutorial. And again, we're talking about getting started with Adobe's After Effects. Now, you'll remember in our first tutorial, we talked about getting your footage into After Effects, whether it's just from the desktop or an external hard drive, or if you happen to be working from one of the major non-linear editing applications, including Premiere, Final Cut Pro 10, and Avid Media Composer. Now, in this second lesson, believe it or not, we're going to talk about exporting. Now, most people say, Kev, why would you talk about exporting in the second tutorial? Well, to be honest, you're probably going to watch tutorial 1, you're going to get the footage in, and then you're going to start playing around with it. And of course, the next logical step is, how do you get that footage out of After Effects and either export it to a file or export it to get it back into your nonlinear editing application? So I thought that we would do exporting in lesson number 2. Now, again, we're going to be talking about exporting files, and we're also going to talk about round tripping from Adobe's After Effects back to Premiere Pro. Okay, short introduction here. Let's just get into Premiere Pro and let's get started. Okay, so let's Command and Tab into Premiere Pro CC 2015. Now, I wanted to start with Premiere because Premiere basically has the smoothest round tripping workflow when working in Adobe's After Effects, because obviously Premiere and After Effects are part of the Creative Cloud. Now, I do have a clip in my timeline here. You can see it just basically, we got a basketball player slam dunking a basketball, very cool. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to send this to Adobe's After Effects, much like we did in lesson 1. I'm simply going to select the clip, I'm going to right click on it, and I'm going to tell Premiere to replace this with an Adobe's After Effects composition. What we're going to do is we're just going to call this, I'll call it basketball player. Okay, and I'm going to save it onto the desktop. I'm simply going to say save. Of course, the clip is going to appear, the comp is going to appear. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to type some text onto the screen. Very simple, very straightforward. Now, we're going to get more into text in a later lesson, so don't worry about that. Just watch for right now. All I'm going to do, simply click anywhere. We'll just type in, why don't we just type in basketball? I'm not going to worry anything about the actual color or anything like that. I'm just going to make the text big and red, and we're going to put it right down here at the bottom of the screen. Okay. Now, to round trip between Premiere Pro and Adobe's After Effects is very simple. All I really need to do at this point is I don't need to export anything from After Effects. I just simply need to save this. I'm simply going to hit Command and S on the Mac, Control and S for all my Windows friends out there. And what's going to happen now is when I Command and Tab back into Premiere Pro, immediately you're going to see basketball appear in my timeline. Now, of course, the bar above my clip has turned red, meaning that this clip will probably need to be rendered. Not playing back in real time, but that's okay. I could give this a simple render right here, and we would be all set to go. Now, there is another way to get your Adobe's After Effects composition into Premiere. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a new Premiere Pro project. I'm not going to save exporting, and we'll just call this exporting number 2. I'm simply going to say OK, and we're going to open this project up, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to import some media. Now, the media that I'm going to import is actually that After Effects project that I have located right here on my desktop. I'm simply going to import that project. Now remember, that project was just saved. We didn't do anything else to it. I'm simply going to import the project. It's going to ask me which composition I want to bring in. Now, of course, I probably would have given it a better name than exporting linked comp 1, and that's okay. I'm simply going to say okay. That clip is now going to appear in my timeline, and I can now simply take it and drop it into a new sequence. And there we go, exactly like we were before. We can actually save out After Effects projects that have multiple compositions in them, and then simply import those compositions into Premiere Pro and drop them into any project that we happen to be working on. Now, of course, this is the absolute smoothest of workflows because, again, After Effects and Premiere are part of the Creative Cloud. But what if you're working in another application like Final Cut Pro 10 or Avid Media Composer? Then what do? Well, let's take a look at those workflows right now. Okay, now before I get into After Effects, I do want to mention the fact that unless you're doing the round tripping technique that I just showed you back to Premiere Pro, essentially the workflow that I show you is going to be the same no matter what non-linear editing application you happen to be using. Final Cut Pro 10, Media Composer, Vegas, it's all going to be the same. Okay, so let's Command and Tab back into Adobe's After Effects, obviously an Alt and Tab for all my Windows friends out there, and I'm just going to keep using the same composition with the same clip and the same super here. And let's talk about exporting this. Now again, like I said, the technique's going to be the same. I'm going to show you how it's slightly different for Media Composer and for Final Cut Pro. And then you can obviously adapt that based on whatever your workflow happens to be, whether it's Vegas or another potential nonlinear editing application. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to call this our comp for export. Okay. Now inside of Adobe's After Effects, to do an actual export, we're not going to be looking for a command that says export, because if we come to the file dropdown, you're going to notice that there is something called export, but you're going to see that we have a few options in here, all of which aren't necessarily what you think that they might be. What we're going to be doing when we export from After Effects is we're actually doing what's called a render. So what we're going to look for is something called the render queue. Now you will actually notice that if I do head on back up to the file dropdown and I come down to export, there is something in here that says add to render queue, which we can do from here. But in most cases, to be honest, I normally, if I come to the top here to the window dropdown, I'm going to come down to the render queue that's located right here. It was actually already right beside my composition, which in most cases is where the render queue tab sits. This is the render queue right here, and basically you'll see that right now it is empty. And to get items into the render queue is actually very simple. All we're going to do is simply take our composition and drag it and drop it right down here. Now to be honest, this is where in many cases the train comes off the tracks, because most people don't know what to do when they get to this point. Now what's most important to keep in mind about the render queue is that it's really broken down into three main components. The first component is the render settings, the second component is the output module, and the last component is the output to. The output to is basically the destination on your hard drive and what you're going to name the file. That's the easiest. But let's first get in and let's talk about the render settings. Now the render settings are basically directly connected to your composition. What exactly do I mean by that? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to click on the render settings right here, and this brings up the render settings window. Now you're going to notice a lot of options in here. Quality, it's going to be the best. The resolution is going to be full. Disk cache is read-only. Proxies, effects, solo switches, guides, color depth, things like that. You're actually going to notice, and even things like motion blur that you can see down here are actually all parameters that you can adjust right here in your composition. You're going to notice there's motion blur right there. We have frame blending right there, things like that. These are what you're going to find inside of the render settings of the render queue. Now what's most important to keep in mind, to be perfectly honest, in about 95% of the time, you're actually not going to adjust anything in here. Because basically, we always want the quality to be the best and the resolution to be full, unless we happen to be exporting just a draft file. And to be honest, in most cases, I don't export draft files, because what I'll do is I'll export a high-res version, and then I'll use a program like it could be Adobe's Media Encoder, it could be MPEG Streamclip, to make an H.264 file to email to a client. Now you're going to see that in a lot of cases, a lot of these parameters reference what you have selected in your composition. You're going to see proxies. We don't want to use any proxies because we want to render at the best possible quality. Do we want to use all of our effects? Well, we could have them all turned on, or we could just have it reference what's going on in the composition. Solo switches, again, if we're isolating channels, again, let's reference the composition. Now, let's talk about a couple in here that you might want to alter. If for some reason you had a frame rate that was a specific frame rate, in this case 23976, and you wanted to alter that as you were exporting, you can get in and do that right here in the frame rate section. But probably the most important parameter, the one that you will be adjusting more than any, is actually located right here, field render. Now, the field render is important. Now, for right now, I'm going to be talking about NTSC North American television. So obviously, based on where you live, this is going to alter slightly. In most cases, you're going to be working in one of two different resolutions if we're talking about HD. You're going to be working in 1080i interlaced, or you'll be working in 1080 23976 frames per second, which is essentially a progressive format. Yes, you might be working in 720p, which is also a progressive format. What's important to keep in mind is that if you happen to be working in a progressive format, your field render will always be set to off. Why? Well, because you don't have any fields. You're working in a progressive format. If you're working in 1080i, an interlaced format, the field render is exceptionally important. For NTSC North American television, for 1080i, your field render is always set to be upper field first. If you happen to be working in standard definition, your field render will always be set to lower field first. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to leave my field render. We're just going to assume that we're going to export for 1080i right now. I'm going to leave my field render set to be upper field first, and I'm simply going to say OK. Now what's going to happen as soon as I say OK is you're going to notice that my best settings will suddenly change. They've now become the custom best settings. So what I want to do is I actually want to get in and start making some templates for these quote-unquote presets that I happen to be making. Now you'll notice that if I come to the drop down right beside custom best settings and I drop that down, you'll see that we have a few in here to choose from, but the one that's most important for me is to make a template. I'm simply going to click on make template. Now you'll see that it's given this template a name and it's been called, appropriately enough, Untitled 1. But what I'm going to do, since I know that this preset, the upper field first one, is always going to be used for 1080i video, I'm just going to call it 1080i. And I'm simply going to say OK. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to come into the 1080i and I'm just going to switch this back to be off. And I'm going to say OK. And what we're going to do is we're going to come down and we're going to make a template out of this, and I'm going to call this 1080p. Now what I should probably do is actually call this 720p/1080p. And we'll say OK. So this way, whether we're working in 720p or 1080p, we happen to know right now that if I drop this down, we'll be using this preset for anything we do that's progressive, and this preset for anything that we do that's interlaced. Okay, so I think that that's pretty straightforward and pretty self-explanatory. So let's move on and let's talk about the third component here, which is the output module. Now the output module is where we're going to get in and we're going to sort of differentiate between Final Cut Pro 10 and we're going to differentiate between Media Composer, because we're going to talk about exporting ProRes files for Final Cut Pro 10 and Avid DNX files, Avid DNX HD QuickTime files for Avid Media Composer, and all of that is set up right from within the output module. Okay, so let's talk about exporting ProRes files for all my Final Cut Pro 10 friends out there. Let's navigate down and I'm simply going to click on the output module for lossless. Once I have it up, this might look a little bit daunting, but just bear with me here and you'll see that it's fairly self-explanatory. Right up at the top, what is the format that you want to export? Well, we're going to be exporting QuickTime, whether it's for Final Cut, whether it's for Media Composer. QuickTime is the file type that we want to export. Okay, now we're not going to do any post-render action. Next, video output. Of course, that's exceptionally important because we are talking about a motion graphics application. You can choose to export the RGB, an alpha if you happen to have it in your composition, or an RGB with an embedded alpha. Now for us, we're just going to stick with RGB. You could change the color depth if you want, but in most cases you're going to use millions of colors, or if you're working with alpha channels, millions of colors plus. Next, the color, do you want it pre-multiplied with matted, or do you want it to be straight and unmatted? I'm just going to leave it because we don't have any matte information. Now next, that's very cool, is that if you happen to want it to export, let's just say, again, approval files a lot smaller. Let's say you're working in 4K inside of Adobe's After Effects. You want it to export at 1280 by 720 to send for client approval. You can actually do all of your resizing right here inside of the output module. You can also do cropping from right here within the output module as well. And if you need to, you can export audio. Now, to be perfectly honest, in most cases, it's very rare that I'm exporting audio from After Effects because in most cases the audio is living inside of my nonlinear editing application, but it's good to have the flexibility to do that as well. Now, most people think, great, I'm done, QuickTime file, boom. No. Because what you may have missed right up here under the format options is this little tiny text that says animation. Well, this little tiny text that says animation represents the codec that this QuickTime file is going to be exported with. And we definitely don't want to export with the animation codec, a fantastic codec, but if you're importing into Media Composer, it means you're going to have to recompress the file, and if you're going to try to import that into Final Cut Pro 10, it's not going to play back in real time. What we want to do is switch the codec to be, of course, ProRes, because we are talking about Final Cut Pro 10 here. So all I'm going to do is simply click on the format options. I'm going to come up to the video codec. I'm going to drop down animation, and you'll see here are all the different codecs that I have at my disposal. You'll see I even have in here GoPro Cineform codec. But what we're looking for is, of course, Apple ProRes, and you can find all of the flavors of ProRes right up here at the top of the codec dropdown. Now I'm just going to go with Apple ProRes 422, just like that. and believe it or not, I'm done. Now, of course, if I had audio that I was exporting as well, I could choose how I wanted to export the audio, but we're going to turn the audio off when we set this up. So all I'm going to do now is simply say OK. I'm going to turn the audio off. Okay, I'm going to say OK. And what we're going to do is, much like we did with the render settings, I'm going to set this up as a template. I'm simply going to click on the drop down. I'm going to come all the way down to the bottom to make template. And of course, we're going to call this Apple ProRes 422. Okay. And all I'm going to do is I'm actually going to send this to the desktop. I'm simply going to say save, and I'm simply going to say render. You'll see, because I haven't really done any animation in this composition, it actually renders super fast. What I'm going to do, simply hide out of Adobe's After Effects. You'll see here is my composition right here. I'm simply going to hit the space bar on the Mac to preview it, and there we go. But most importantly, if I right click on this file and I say open with, let's just open it with QuickTime Player 7 here. I'm going to navigate up to Window. I'm going to come down to Show Movie Inspector just to show you that this file has been exported as a 23976 progressive file in the Apple ProRes 422 codec. Basically, this clip is ready to be brought into Final Cut Pro 10 and dropped into any project you happen to be working on. Okay, so how do we get in and set things up for Avid Media Composer editors? Well, let's Command and Tab back into Adobe's After Effects, and obviously I have rendered this item out of the render queue as a final clip. But what I'd like to do is I'd actually like to duplicate this render queue item and queue it up exactly the way the previous item was queued up. So what I'm going to do is simply press Command and D to duplicate this instance, this item in the render queue, and you'll see now that I have another render basically set to go the exact same parameters as I had before. The only difference is that After Effects has renamed the clip _1 because, well, it knows that I've already exported a clip called this name. Okay, so let's get in and let's set this up for all of you Avid Media Composer editors out there. Exactly the same process. What I'm going to do, simply click on the Apple ProRes 422. I'm going to navigate to Format Options. I'm going to navigate to the video codec of Apple ProRes 422. We're going to drop that down, and I'm going to come down to the Avid DNX HD codec. Now, it's a little bit different with the Avid DNX codec because we actually have a few options that we need to set inside the actual codec settings themselves, which we didn't have access to with ProRes. ProRes is a fairly standard Mac codec. What I'm going to do is simply click on the codec settings. Now you'll see nothing too complicated in here. The first thing you need to decide is, what do you want the color levels to be, 709 or RGB? If you are exporting with an alpha, do you want that alpha to be compressed or uncompressed? But most importantly, the resolution. Now I know that working in 2398 frames per second, that I'm going to be using a codec of DNX HD 175. So all I'm going to do is simply take the resolutions, I'm going to drop them down, and I'm going to find the 23976p DNX HD codec, and I'm going to choose the 175 version of it, 8-bit, just like such. Now again, like I said, you can set this to be 709 or RGB depending on what you need. I'm simply going to say OK. I'm simply going to say OK. I'm simply going to say OK, much like we did before. I'm going to take this, I'm going to drop it down, I'm going to come down to Make Template. I'm going to come up here, we're going to call this, of course, Avid DNX HD 175. I'm simply going to say OK. We'll just call this for Avid, just to make it a little bit different here, just then _1. And I'm going to say save, and I'm going to say render, just like such. Okay. Again, much like I had done before. Now you'll notice that I am on a Mac, so because this file's a ProRes, the Mac will give me a preview of it right here on my desktop. Not the same with a codec QuickTime that it doesn't understand, like Avid DNX HD. So what I'm going to do is, instead of attempting to open it in QuickTime 10 and have QuickTime 10 convert it, I'm just simply going to open it with QuickTime 7 here, just like that. I'm going to navigate up to Window, I'm going to come down to Show Movie Inspector, and you'll see that this clip has been rendered out with the Avid DNX HD codec 1920 by 1080 at 23976 frames per second. Of course, I could hit play, and there we go. Now there is something else that I do want to mention. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to Command and Tab back into Adobe's After Effects. I'm going to select both items in the render queue, and I'm simply going to hit delete. Let's just say we happen to be working along. We got a whole bunch of different, compositions we're working on. We want to, export some files. Okay, we're going to take this composition and we're going to drag it down and we're going to drop it into the render queue. But you'll notice that I seem to have lost those presets that I had just created. Well, I haven't technically lost anything. They're still there. They're actually just buried down here in the menu, because the best settings is always the default. And you'll notice here that lossless is always the default. But I really don't want that to be the default. Let's just say hypothetically I wanted the Apple ProRes and I wanted the 720p, 1080p render settings to be the presets. How do I get in and alter that? Well, basically what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to navigate up to the edit menu, and we're going to come down to templates. Now let's start with the render settings first of all. Okay, I'm going to come into the render settings. Now you're going to notice that we have a bunch of different options as far as the render settings go. We have a standard movie default, a frame default, a pre-rendered default, a movie proxy default, and a still proxy default. You'll see the best settings are chosen for pretty much, the majority of them, the main three of them here. But what if essentially, since we're going to be exporting movies in most cases, what if we didn't want the best settings? What we wanted the setting that we created, the 720p, 1080p setting. Now, to be perfectly honest, there's some settings in here that you might never use. Like, let's say, for example, you're never going to use the DV settings. Well, you can simply select them and press delete, and they're now gone forever. Okay, but in this case, I'm not going to go through deleting anything. All I want to do is just change things up a little bit. So for the movie default, I'm simply going to drop that down, and I'm going to choose 720p, 1080p. I'm simply going to say, okay, let's do it again here, except this time, we're going to do it for the output module. And again, I said we're going to assume that we're doing Apple ProRes, so all I'm going to do for the movie default is simply choose Apple ProRes 422. Now, it's not going to change for anything that I have in my render queue, but it will change if I bring a new clip down into the render queue. You'll see the default now has changed to be the render settings of 720p and 1080p and the output module of Apple ProRes 422. Okay, so this wraps up our basic look at exporting or rendering items out of Adobe's After Effects. If you're working in Premiere, you're going to be doing round tripping all the time by basically doing a send to, or creating that composition inside of Premiere to open in After Effects, and then simply doing a save to send it back. If you didn't do that method and you just created something in After Effects, simply save it out and just import that composition into Premiere and drop it into whatever timeline you happen to be working on. For anybody else working on any other NLE out there, you're going to need to export either QuickTime files, or they could be AVI files or any other type of file that you need based on your nonlinear editing application, so that you can get those files out. And the render queue is exceptionally important. You're going to want to make sure that in that output module, you set that codec to be absolutely correct. So this way, what things look like in After Effects is what they're going to look like inside of your non-linear editing application. So if you have any questions, you have any comments, or you have any tutorial requests, you can send them to kevinpmcauliffe@gmail.com. This has been Kevin P. McAuliffe. Thanks a lot for watching.